Hello again, and welcome to another week. Looks like we may get to meet together next week in person, and I know there's still some time between now and then. Anything could develop at any time. I just want people to be very assured that if you feel comfortable coming to church and you feel like it's the thing that you need to do, then we will see you as soon as the doors are open. If you feel that it's still best for you to keep some distance for some time, that you also have the freedom to do that. And so with that being said, this week, this location, some of you may already know where I am, but behind me is one road, and then further behind me is Interstate 40. So I'm just here, I guess south of the casino, you could say, on Airport Road. And to my right, up the hill to the east, there's a house, and even this road here, where it crosses under the bridge of I-40, I've always, not always, but sometimes when I'm driving I-40, I see it and I look over and I think, how do you get there again? So for some reason, this road has always stuck out of my mind. I've always noticed it, and the alfalfa behind me is very pretty this time of year. And so, speaking of roads, the place that we find ourselves today for our lesson, our sermon, whatever you want to call it, is the Gospel of Luke. And Luke was a physician, so not to be stereotypical about physicians, but he probably was very thoughtful and very intentional in how he laid out his gospel. And he even says as much, that he set to write things down as they happened. And so a lot of people look at Luke and they say he is chronological, and so if there's any departure in the other gospels, it's that author's liberty that brought that departure about. But if you want to follow chronologically a timeline, that Luke is the one to look to. So Luke chapter 24 is where we'll be, and I'll say this morning, even though I'm doing this on Saturday evening, is where we'll be this morning, Luke 24, and verses 1 through 12 is his account of the resurrection. Other gospels spend more time than that. The Gospel of John gives more accounts than Luke does. Luke just says that the women, they prepared spices and they perfumes in the last verse of chapter 23, and on the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. And I thought that was an interesting thing to add in there. But on the first day of the week, they got up, they prepared, they did all these things. And so the women go to the tomb, not just Mary Magdalene alone, but in Luke's account, it's the women. And so they see Jesus's body is gone, and they go back to report to the disciples what had happened. And so Peter, verse 12, runs to the tomb. He looks in, he sees the wrappings, he goes away to his home marveling at what had happened. So Luke's version of the resurrection and the events following it immediately is a little bit truncated compared to others. And so verse 13 is where we'll start, the road to Emmaus. I'd like to read all of this. It's a bit long, but I think it's important. Behold, two of them were gathering that very day. And behold, two of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were walking with each other. They were talking, I cannot read today, with each other about all these things which had taken place. And so I'm assuming this is the event surrounding Jesus' death, which we'll see why it's not the resurrection here in a minute. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you're exchanging with one another as you were walking?" And they stood still, looking sad. And so Jesus appears beside them and starts traveling with them. Apparently that wasn't uncommon. It didn't raise any sort of suspicion. And if Jesus' death happened around the time of the Passover, like history tells us, like the Gospels tell us, there were probably lots of people traveling back and forth at this time. And so we've got two people, it says two of them, and these are disciples. We'll get one of their names here in a minute. They're traveling on the road back to Emmaus, and they're talking about all the things that had happened. Jesus comes and stands beside them, And he asks, "What are you talking about as you're walking?" Verse 18, one of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to Jesus, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of these things which have happened here in these days?" Have you been living in a cave? Basically, he's saying. And Jesus said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and in word and in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to the sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it's the third day since these things happened. But also some women among us amazed us. When they went to the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body, they came saying that they had seen a vision of angels and said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it exactly as the women also had said, but him they did not see." Now, I think this is interesting. Jesus is letting them tell their account of the story. And so he's asking, what things are you talking about? How have you experienced this? What is your perception? What is your history with this? What's your interaction? How are you internalizing all of these events? Jesus lets them explain that to him. And I think that's neat that Jesus does that. I think he does the same with each of us. He lets us have our version of how things happened. The four Gospels each have their version of how things happen, and I think Jesus is allowing the same freedom to Cleopas and whoever this other person is with him. And so they said, verse 24, the women went to the tomb, and it was exactly, the men found it exactly as the women had said. Jesus then responds, verse 25, "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. And they approached the village where they were going. He acted as though he were going farther. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it's getting toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began giving it to them. So here he goes again, much like the Last Supper prior to his death. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" They got up that very hour, returned to Jerusalem, and found gathered together the 11 and those who were with them, saying, "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." They began to relate their experiences on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of bread. There's lots of little gnats flying around here down in this bottom. And so we've got Jesus who appears to them. They don't know it's him, which is somewhat of a common theme after his post-resurrection appearances. And so it was the same with Mary and the same with others. I'm sure these are the two accounts at least that we have of this. And so Jesus appears to him, to these men, and he says, verse 25 and 6, that they're foolish, they're slow of heart, they're not believing the prophets. And was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory? Jesus says, isn't it necessary for the Messiah to have done these things that have happened to Jesus of Nazareth, whom they don't know is standing right in front of them? And so they are weeping, and Jesus talks to them, and he asks them these questions, and they say, verse 21, "But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel." That is a pivotal verse in this account here. We were hoping that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Translation, we were hoping that he was going to be the one that would bring about the world as we wanted it to be. We were hoping that he's the one who would finally do what my great-great-grandfather was waiting on the Messiah to do, what my dad talked to me about, what the newspaper printed, that when the Messiah comes, this is what he's going to do. when the Messiah comes, this is how he's going to look. When God intervenes, and they may have not thought it was God, but it was a Messiah, a person, I think, more so than a deity. That's another reason why they missed him. That when the Messiah of Israel was to come, that he would bring about and alter their experiences, their history, their lives in such a way, and it was not what Jesus came and did. If you find this as a theme that we've been talking about for the last few weeks, it's I don't know how you could avoid this theme. That we have this idea, they had this idea, we're no different, of what God is going to do when God comes. Now, I always warn us, or not always, I often warn us to be very, very careful of how we think the end times, quote, are going to play out. Because we have this idea that God is going to return and God is going to be upset with these people, and he's going to punish those people, and he's going to reward these people, and he's going to bring about history in a certain way. He's going to create this, he's going to destroy that, he's going to do all of these things. They had the same idea of Christ whenever the Messiah comes, and yet that's not what the Messiah did. But let's look, and I want to point out just a couple of things of what the Messiah did when he came. Now, all the teaching leading up prior to Jesus' death is in the Gospels. What we're talking about here is very specifically on this road to Emmaus. Now, why did I choose this location? I think this road is interesting. As I've been sitting here, the people up the hill, I don't know if they're watching me with binoculars possibly. No one has come down this road right behind me. But I don't know, hundreds of cars have passed along I-40. These people are leaving Jerusalem, going back to Emmaus on a road that they had probably traveled numerous times. Somebody starts walking beside them. They don't recognize that it's Jesus. It says they've been prevented from recognizing it was Jesus. Now, did God prevent them? Did God put blinders on their eyes? We don't know. It's very possible that their understanding of God prevented them from seeing Jesus. It's very possible that how they explained God's work in the world, how they their theology that they held, whatever it is, that their expectations of Jesus and Jesus himself were not the same. Therefore, they were prevented from seeing Jesus. I don't think this was some divine intervention. I think it's just like us. We're looking for Jesus to appear and behave in a certain way, and Jesus doesn't always do that. And so we think, well, I can't wait till Jesus finally shows up, and he might be walking right beside us on the road, and we don't recognize him. So he asked them, explain to me what things you're talking about. What is your letdown? What is your disappointment? What is your telling of these events that have come forth? And so they tell him. Then he says they're foolish. They do not understand. Now, if we think that that is not going to be some sort of an assessment that God might have of us whenever God returns in the end, however that happens, when Christ returns in the end, you foolish people, how could you not understand that it needed to be this way according to the scripture and prophets? You don't understand. I would be very hesitant. For myself personally, I'm very hesitant to come to any sort of strong conclusion about how God's work in the world unfolds. So he calls them foolish men. Then, verse 27, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. And I've always heard people say, wouldn't that have been a beautiful thing to have seen? Now, why Luke didn't write that down, I don't know. I think it's interesting that God apparently believes that we can get by on much less information than we think we need. Wouldn't it be wonderful, man, if we just understood and heard and had that record of what Jesus explained, life would make perfect sense. But it seems like God doesn't think that we need that information. And as they approached, verse 28, the village where they were going, Jesus acted as though he were going further. I read a commentary and a lady said about this verse that Jesus is unflinchingly dedicated to our freedom. That Jesus allows us to go on, allows us to let him go on. They could have parted ways at this point and it would have been fine. Jesus acted as though he were going further. he did not go in until, what does it say? Verse 29, they urged him, they implored him, they badgered him, maybe is a better word, saying, stay with us, for it's getting towards evening. Not stay with us, explain more, but stay with us, it's getting towards evening, the day is now over. Now, whether they really wanted Jesus to be with them because of how he was explaining scriptures, or if they were just being kind and saying, it's getting dark, you should just stay here and go the rest of the way in the morning. I'm not sure what's happening. Verse 30, 29, he goes in to stay with them. And then verse 30, when he had reclined at the table with them. Now, this is, I think, very similar language. I didn't look it up, but in my mind, he's reclining at the table in the Last Supper. When he reclines at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it. Breaking it, he gave it to them. Then, in the blessing and the breaking of the bread and the giving of the bread to them, that's what caused them to recognize the Christ. Then their eyes were opened, then they recognized him, and then he vanished from their sight. Unfortunately, gosh, they were probably kicking themselves thinking, how in the world, why couldn't we have kept him around? That very hour, they hop up and they run back to Jerusalem to talk to the 11. That very hour, and it says it was getting late, so they probably got back to Jerusalem 10 o'clock or midnight or something. It would have been dark, probably dangerous travel. Now, a couple of observations I want to make about this is, first of all, look at what Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, the very first occurrence after his resurrection. So he hasn't been to the upper room according to Luke's account. If we just read Luke's account, he's been resurrected. They go, they find the empty tomb. Where does Jesus find himself? On the road to Emmaus. Now, the question is it that road way back there, or is it this road right here? Which would we have been walking on? Some busy road that has all kinds of commerce and business happening, trucks going, money being made, deliveries, people going to visit family and friends, all kinds of plans and intentions, or this little tiny road right here that maybe gets traveled a handful of times a day. Whatever it is, they're on this road, whichever road that is. Secondly, look at how Jesus, let's see, how do I say this? Jesus did not go. If it would have been me, I would have risen from the grave. I would have gone to find Pontius Pilate. I would have gone to find the leaders of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and so forth. The defense attorney that was breathing down my neck as Jesus in that illegal trial that happened in the middle of the night, the one who told all kinds of lies about me, the one who made false accusations and charges against me, the one who ultimately caused me to be put to death in a very gruesome manner. If I was Jesus, I would have had his number and been knocking down his door to seek a little vengeance and a little repayment at the time. I would have been, if I were Jesus, going up to the temple, shouting with a bullhorn or whatever it was that they used for amplification back then, amplification. I would have grabbed that thing and I would have shouted from the mountaintops, I'm risen just like I said I was going to. Now who wants to follow? I would have rented a plane to pull a banner in the sky. I would have bought some space on the scrolling marquee downtown. I would have bought a paid ad to put full page on the back sheet of the Clinton Daily News. I would have posted it on Facebook, myself, a selfie of me alive and doing well, and with a little scroll down at the bottom, I told you so, or something smart aleck like that. Jesus didn't do any of that. If Jesus would have had a Twitter or Facebook account, I still don't think he would have done any of that. That Jesus rose from the dead, and where does he find himself immediately according to Luke's account? On the road to Emmaus, talking to two people as they're traveling. Then what does he do? He takes the time to go to their house, and then he takes the time to break bread. He exists in very ordinary ways, in ways that our understandings of him constantly are causing us to not recognize and see him. I think that's a very valid concern that we should have. That's something that we should be concerned about, that we should pray about whenever we say for certain that this is how God is, this is who God is, this is define God in this way. Theology proper is what it's called. These are the attributes of God. This is what God is like. This is God's plan. This is how these scriptures are to be understood, and so forth. They were upset because he was the one that they had hoped would do a certain thing. He didn't do that certain thing. Therefore, they concluded he wasn't who he said he was. What was wrong was their misunderstanding, or was their understanding of who Jesus was and what he was bringing about. So that doesn't seem like an important place to be, but I would say it's a highly important place to be, because what Jesus did was he just revealed to them who he was, how he was, what he was, and so forth. And he breaks bread with them. He takes the time to do that. Jesus is, here comes a car. Jesus is, I'm going to wave at him so they don't think I'm doing anything weird. So Jesus' existence at this time, he is, now I may have to cut this out of the video. I'm a little bit shaken now. Jesus took the time to be with them. Apparently there wasn't anything more important for Jesus to do at that time than to spend a good evening with a couple of disciples on a road heading away from the most important place that Jesus surely could have been. He was walking away from Jerusalem, it seems. Now, as soon as they recognize him, he disappears from their midst. And I would say that is often how God works in our lives. Some people call them mystical experiences, that we have them, the world feels as one, everything seems as it should, and then within a handful of minutes, that's gone. So we thank God for when those times come. We thank God for when God is near to us, but God is almost always near to us in ways that we do not expect. He's not shouting from the mountaintops. He's not forcing his way into our home. He's not barricading himself and in our hearts and saying, when are you going to listen? It's not this wrestling match. It's more of a, do you mind if I walk with you? I'm going to go on. You guys have a good evening, until they implore him to come. Then he stays with them. And it's in the very common breaking of the bread and the serving, does it say the serving of the wine? They began to relate their experiences on the road and how he recognized them in the breaking of the bread. It's the very common places where Jesus is recognized. It's the very common places where Jesus shows up. But as long as we're waiting for the Messiah to show up as we had hoped, we're going to continue waiting, I think. And we pray that Jesus would break through and he would walk with us on our way to Arapahoe, on our way to Elk City, on our way to Hydro, on our way to Cordell, wherever it is, that God would show up and be with us. Now, don't let this just be, closing thoughts here, don't let this just be I need to correct my theology and my understanding of God. I think there are lots of things that we have all hoped for, that we hope. I hope that I live a long and healthy life. I hope that my body holds out. I hope that I don't get cancer. I hope that I don't spend 3 to 4 years on my back in a nursing home waiting to die. I hope that my marriage stays together. I hope that my kids do well for themselves and that they make good choices. I hope. I hope this coronavirus ends soon. I hope, fill in the blank, whatever it is. Sometimes those things don't go how we hoped. Can we still find God even so? And I think that's the exercise that we have. I hope you all have a good day today. Enjoy your most likely last Sunday off. And I'll see some of you next week, if not before then, according to the plan at this point. And God bless each of you. And I pray that we would have the eyes to see and the ears to hear God's very present and real work in our lives and in this world. Thank you. God bless.